Welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. Normally I'm a lazy bum and I go outside and buy myself like some fancy iced coffee. For History Matters, I made coffee today. Actually, I'm feeling very fancy for doing the pathetically easy thing that I should normally do. At any rate, obviously, given the day that we are today and the fact that Tuesday is the election, we're going to be talking about democracy and this coming election within a few minutes. Those of you who are here, I am glad you have joined. But before we begin, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will tell us the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History at the University of Richmond, and I'm joining you from the historic Jefferson School in downtown Charlottesville today. And I'm pleased, as every Friday, to be with Joanne and John and our friends from History Matters. I love reading the chat, and when I can, I try and participate, but we are here to discuss today's topic and engage you all in a conversation. The way that happens is you put lovely, thought-provoking questions in the Q&A, and then we get to give those to Joanne in about a half an hour. So anything that you want to ask Joanne specifically about today's topic, please put that in the Q&A. Everything else goes in the chat. And at the end of the day, I will save the chat. We post that in our Slack channel, our community here. And if you're interested in joining that, one of our friends will put directions for that in the chat. But your questions definitely need to go in Q&A. All right, we'll see you in a bit.
Excellent. And I will say, if there are folks who are first timers here, please let us know, because the History Matters community is a community and they will welcome you. Be sure that when you're in chat, you're beaming into all participants or whatever the Zoom wording is there, and keep everything family friendly. Okay. I have to say, I try very hard to ignore chat. It always engages me. And what I saw floating along the bottom of my screen while I was trying to ignore it unsuccessfully, obviously, was it's King Tut Day. So it could be King Tut Day. I love the fact that I saw that. But okay, let us get into our topic at hand, because it is an important topic. And I'm obviously, with the election coming on Tuesday, I was going to talk about something today that has to do with the election. Part of the reason I'm taking the approach I'm taking today is because of some of what I've seen on Twitter, as it still exists as of now. Who knows what'll happen down the road, but I've seen people responding, and actually for the most part in a friendly way, but still, when I talk about how this election is urgent, sometimes people will respond and say, every election is urgent. We hear this every election, this is election rhetoric, please stop. Or even people who are not specifically responding to me, I've seen other people saying this is just Democrat, capital D, Democratic Party rhetoric, right? They're just like, they're pretending like they're the only party that's supporting democracy, and the election is just like any other election. It's no big deal, right? That every election sees broad claims, every election sees lying, every election sees each side claim that the other side is bad. And all told, people have been saying in one way or another, some people, that the idea that democracy is on the ballot, which you see over and over and over again, is a massive exaggeration. Well, I'm here today to say it isn't. I'm here today, and this is not going to surprise anyone who has been coming to our weekly History Matters conversation. No one's going to say, gasp, Joanne thinks democracy is at risk. I've been in one way or another saying that for a very long time. But I want to talk about that specifically today. I want to address this idea that this is just like any other election. And I know that since many of you have been coming here every Friday, you already have stored up probably a bunch of reasons why I would assume this is not an urgent, important election. But regardless, on the off chance that there are folks here who aren't sure, or who don't think it's that out of the ordinary, or who will watch this later and perhaps don't think there's an urgency to this election, for all of those reasons and more, that is what I want to address this morning. The fact that democracy is on the ballot, that this isn't just more rhetoric, more of the same, that this is the same urgency that comes along with every election. Yes, elections prompt urgent rhetoric. They bring forth nasty claims from one party towards the other. There's all kinds of stuff that gets into the air leading up to an election. That's a long-standing tradition. You know, I remember writing my most recent book, lurking over my shoulder there, The Field of Blood. I can't remember now what state this member of Congress is from, but he talks about how actually what he's a member of Congress who had a problem with alcohol. And he says something about how he mostly has a problem with drinking in the excitement of elections. But then he says something like, but the excitement of elections seems to never go down. So I always have a drinking problem. The point he makes is that there's always this urgency. There's always this sense that, you know, who knows what's going to happen next. And I'm going to come back to that idea, who knows what's going to happen next, because that's important. But at any rate, democracy is on the ballot. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means with a couple specific examples of things that are happening around us that indicate this is not a normal election, even just as a midterm election. So number one, and probably most obvious, is the number of Republican candidates running for office who deny still the results of the last presidential election. Apparently more than half, and I saw different numbers all over the place. So I ended up with more than half because one said 51%, one said 60 something percent. Let's go with the low. 51% of Republicans on the ballot on local and national level are in one way or another election deniers. Apparently half of that number are running for office in sort of easily won by a Republican races, right? So roughly half of that 51% might very well get put into office. Meaning, even if some of them are simply claiming that they don't believe in the prior election because it's the thing to do and it makes, they assume it sells well in some way or gets support in some way, regardless of their reason for doing this. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes too. They are deliberately undermining our trust in the electoral process, essentially saying that if you don't like an election, it doesn't count. That's what election denial boils down to, because we've seen charges of fraud tried in court again and again and again without real proof of the kind of fraud that people keep claiming. There is no proof that this election is a fraud at all, nor has there been in the years since that election. And it doesn't matter to some of the people making this claim. What they're doing in making the claim is simply saying, we want elections to go a certain way, and if they don't go the way that we want them to, we may very well object. Some have said that quite openly, right? We've seen some people asked up front, will you abide by whatever happens in this coming election? And some candidates for office have not answered or said something. Actually, one, I believe, said, if I win, I will. Okay, now let's claim that they're joking. Ha ha. That kind of joke, number one, that feels like the kind of joke that you say something you really mean, and then when someone calls you on it, you say, oh, just kidding. That kind of joke, again, is undermining faith in our democratic political process. It's saying you can question contests, you can question elections, sure. Anybody's doing it. Look, I'm doing it. It's normalizing the idea that a free and fair election conducted fairly, and if people have questions about that, you can investigate them. And then if there's no evidence of fraud, you surrender those charges. It's suggesting that any election can be challenged in that way by anyone for no reason, right? So that just the fact that there are these people who are openly refusing to believe in the outcome of a free and fair election when there is no proof that it wasn't free and fair, and that they're running in some ways on that idea, that's amounts to a refusal to accept terms that you don't like. That's just a direct slap in the face of democracy. I'm going to come back to this at the end, but democracy is about contests. It's about competition. It's about unknown outcomes. It's about competing for office. It's about the public having the ability to put the people they want in office and take them out if they like. It's about all of these things. So if you are denying an election that has not been proven unfair, right, a fair election, you're claiming, and if you're claiming your willingness to denounce any election that you don't like, you are openly slapping democracy in the face. Democracy has a face now. You're openly denouncing the idea that contest, competition, my favorite word, contingency, all of the things that are at the heart of democracy, accountability, you're essentially saying none of those things really formally count. Now, linked to that is something that some people have hinted at, others have not, but it's a direct link to the idea that people are denying the last election. People are hinting that they may not accept this election if it seems unfair. And actually, I don't know if I want to quote him. A certain person who shall go nameless apparently said at a campaign in the last day or two, there will never be a fair election again. You want to talk about undermining faith in our electoral process? There you go. At any rate, if you're denying the validity of an election that has been proven free and fair, sure suggests that you are claiming the right to question the coming election. Now, you can question it. You can come forward if you have proof, with proof that proves it wasn't free and fair. We have a process for that. But once that process has been put into play, you then accept the outcome, right? You don't go through the process and then say, oh, whatever. They didn't believe it. The courts proved nothing. And I still claim that this election, I'm questioning the validity of this election. What you have in that case is just our inability to have elections that come up with conclusive results. If there are people who are always willing to step forward and say, it actually really doesn't matter what the evidence says, that seems unfair, I don't like it, and thus I will not accept it. Again, the core basis of our democratic, small d, political process is being eroded, is being undermined, is being attacked. Along similar lines, we recently had a Wisconsin candidate for governor openly say that if he wins, he will fix things so that Republicans never lose office again. Think about that for a moment. Everything that I said before, democracy is contest, competition, public opinion, accountability, contingency. Democracy is not one party rule by force. Democracy isn't one group of people have power and no one else can ever have it again. Democracy is not, there is no valid opposition. Democracy is inherently incompatible with the idea. So it seems like I shouldn't even have to say this, that I will fix it so that Republicans never lose office again. Really? And I know everyone is saying, wow, he said the quiet part out loud. I don't think it's the quiet part for many people. Some are remaining quiet and some are not abiding by these extreme views, but there are some people on the right who are just out and out openly stating this sort of thing, like this candidate for governor in Wisconsin. I don't know if his last name is pronounced Michaels or Mitchells. Tim, M-I-C-H-E-L-S, is the one who said it, apparently on videotape, so you can see him say it. One party rule with zero accountability to the voters. That's not democracy. I shouldn't need to say that, but that's not democracy. Then we have we've heard about this, particularly, I believe, in Arizona. People who are watching ballot boxes who are armed and are taking notes, apparently, noting license plates, just kind of hanging out, watching ballot boxes. Now, and I actually had one person contact me, and she actually said she lives in a rural area and she's afraid to vote. That's what these armed men at ballot boxes are doing. I've talked before about bullying and the power of bullying, and that all that matters is the idea that the threats that you're making might be fulfilled. The guys with the guns at the ballot boxes don't have to do anything. They just have to spread the idea that they're armed and watching. And that's going to keep some people from voting. That's the purpose of it. And the claim may be, well, we want to like make sure there's no voter fraud. You could do that without guns. And I'm not going to go into guns, but if you're with a gun, some of them dressed in camo, apparently, watching these ballot boxes, you are sending a message, a very deliberate message. Again, you have a right as a citizen in a democracy to vote. People shouldn't be making it harder for you to vote. People shouldn't be trying to prevent you from voting. They shouldn't be trying to scare you away or intimidate you from voting. Not the first time that this has happened in American history. We have a long history of trying in one way or another, particularly white people trying to terrify Black people from voting in one way or another. Jim Crow, right? It's not like, and I'm going to come back to this idea too, it's not like some of the things I'm talking about here are brand new, but the combination of them and the way in which they're being supported openly up front by some people with a lot of power, that's a big problem. Finally, last but certainly not least, we have people seemingly accepting, and some even glorying in the threat of violence, right? Laughing at violence, not denouncing violence. Again, the first time there's been violence, threatened violence, people responding the wrong way to violence. It's not a brand new thing happening right now, but in the current climate, given everything that I just said, if you are seemingly very comfortable with the idea of violence, or not uncomfortable with the idea of violence, and that's clear to the public, that matters. Again, that's an inherent threat. If you're not denouncing violence, that happens. If it just happens and no one says anything, on a certain level, it's been accepted. I said this before when I talked about hearings about January 6th. I said that, having hearings, even if the hearings end up doing nothing, having the hearings was vital, because by having the hearings, you had our government standing up and saying a line has been crossed. That behavior on January 6th was unacceptable. And we are going to have a hearing because we are all saying a line was crossed and that was unacceptable. Nothing might happen, but without that hearing, essentially it's saying that that behavior is acceptable. It's okay. No one really objected to it. There was no action taken. Accountability. I've said this a lot too in recent years. Accountability of people with power to the people who give them power is one of the things at the heart of democratic governance. And part of holding people accountable is consequences, is having hearings, is stepping forward even and saying as a public figure, that's unacceptable. Accountability, simple accountability. I think at some point I tweeted out accountability, lack of accountability is the crisis of our time. It's one of the crises of our time, but it is one of them. Now, many of you already know this. I'm going to, again, sort of repeat some of it. Has been a lot of commentary from scholars of authoritarianism, looking at the pattern of things that is happening right now in the United States and saying, that typically authoritarian movements begin with attempts to delegitimize elections. They promote a stolen election narrative, even though they know it's false, to gain power. And in some cases, that becomes institutionalized, that kind of lying, that kind of rejecting results of elections, which is what we're leaning towards now, that denying elections becomes part of the norm of a party. If it happens with lots of people all over the place, all different states, local elections of all kinds, plus national elections, that's more than people suspecting elections. That's just all elections anywhere are suspect. Again, a problematic thought. So it becomes institutionalized anti-democratic activity in a way. These kinds of politicians are essentially, what do I want to say, cooperating or certainly jointly making that kind of anti-democratic dogma, right? Elections are just unfair, as a norm when it comes to campaigns and the democratic electoral process. So what we're looking at here, it's not mere rhetoric, as some have said to me. It's not the same thing we see at every election. We have seen aspects of what we're seeing now before. So I don't think it's right as a historian to say, this is all new. What is new is having people in power in the government, as well as a former president, all coming together and doing this jointly. What is different is that these aren't floating ideas. This isn't sporadic problems with local elections. I've written about congressional elections where no one could agree on who won or who lost, and two sets of candidates were sent to Congress, and it was a big to-do because no one could decide who won the election. Individual things that we're seeing now are not new. The bundle of them, in the way that we're seeing them, openly, boastfully, basically acting as campaign fodder, joined with other things I'm not even going to go into. There's a longer list. But the way in which these things are being used now as campaign fodder, the way in which they're being openly promoted by people running for office, the way that what they're promoting is inherently questioning the absolute basis of our democratic system of government. The fact that a lot of these people denying elections and saying things like Republicans should always be in power are going to win local office and then have the power to affect elections. This is a real crisis. It's not rhetoric. It's not exaggerated. And we've had crises in American history before. That's what other people often say to me is, oh, we always have crises. We've had lots of crises, and they are not necessarily the same, right? I don't think any two crises are exactly the same. We have our own crisis right now, and it has its own blend of factors. People in power openly, aggressively denouncing the democratic process, consistently, together, using it as a kind of party message. That's serious. It's serious in its implications as far as erosion of trust in democracy, the democratic process. It's serious in the implications about what it means for politics to come. It's serious in what it suggests about people who win office based on that claim. There is urgency to this election for all of these reasons. What we're seeing now is some people, seemingly a good chunk of people running for office on one side, who are not holding to their heart some of the basic things about democracy that cohere it, that hold it and preserve it. Free and fair elections, contests for power, chance, change, contingency. the vital importance and centrality of public opinion on who has power. All of these things are being openly denounced by some on the right. And it's vital to remember, again, I've said this a lot too, democracy isn't eternal. It's vulnerable. And no matter how strong the institutions have been and seem, it can be undermined. And we've taken it for granted. We've taken for granted the fact that the United States has a democratic form of government, is in many ways superior in its democracy to the rest of the world, that it's what makes us distinctive as Americans. We can't take democracy for granted. And if nothing else, that's what recent events, recent years should be teaching us. Don't count on the arc of history and moving towards justice. Don't count on the fact that, well, of course we have democracy, and of course democracy will survive, and of course our institutions of government will protect it. Our institutions of government are trying, right? I'm not saying democracy will, here's an early poof, collapse. I am saying that it is under threat in a sincere, open, obvious way, and that we are looking at an election that could fundamentally make it harder to preserve democracy in America. That's the simple facts. There's a disease that's spreading through our political system in many ways. This is not any longer about Donald Trump. It's about legitimate elections and how people are acting about and talking about and treating elections and their legitimacy. And a lot of that is now up in the air. I saw online someone, and I brilliantly, bad historian Joanne didn't write down the name of the person who said it. So person who said this, it's not me, said something along the lines of, this won't be a direct quote, that we're looking at the Ukrainians and we're impressed by what they're doing and we're proud they're fighting for their own democracy. But democracy normally doesn't die through invasions. It normally dies from within. An authoritarian leader is elected, they start to change the rules, they start to change who the other people in office are, they start to change the referees, they eat away at norms, they eat away at guardrails. You erode people's acceptance and the legitimacy of institutions that are essential to democratic rule. That's how democracies fall. So for folks who have been saying, come on, why are we worried about democracy? What really matters now is the economy. Good luck doing anything to shape the economy, or as you might want it to be, after you surrender democracy. Yes, the economy is vitally important. Yes, but putting food on the table is vitally important. But surrendering basic democracy in favor of that, you won't be serving that. That can't be served in any effective way once you surrender your fundamental power over people who are in office. I see I'm over time here, so I will wrap this towards a close so that we can have a conversation. Obviously, part of what I'm saying is it can happen here. We're in the middle of watching something happen, not foreordained results, but we need to act. And in the immediate future, what that means is vote. Vote. Help other people vote. Help get people to the polls. Do what you can to simply get people to go to the polls, to fulfill their rights as American citizens, to vote for who they'd like to give power to. Do it while it's in full bloom. Do it to preserve that very thing. People are saying vote as though your life depends on it, because it does. The problem, and I've talked about this before, not necessarily here, but actually Heather and I have talked about this. I might have mentioned it here before, that we've been careful in our own discussion of current politics not to seem too alarmist too early, because certainly I've been worried that if I got alarmist loud and alarmist too early, people would no longer hear me after a certain point when I really, really felt the need to be alarmist. I'm now being alarmist. I really am. I honestly feel that this coming election is going to be vitally important. If things go one way or another way, will things automatically change and become horrible? Not the next day, but certain possibilities will become more possible, even likely, and other possibilities will become less likely and even impossible. We will be set on a path, and the direction that we're going on that path can be drastically different depending on who has power after this coming election. In a sense, we're looking at a campaign that for some is an attempt to seize the system, the democratic system, and hold it forever by shaping it as they like it. Please, please do what you can to support the democratic process. I know you've heard this a million times. I'm saying it now, I guess with just a little extra urgency boost. It matters a lot. It's not just rhetoric. There truly is a threat. It's not just something that Democrats have been saying to get votes. And hopefully, at least I've managed to persuade some people in my comments here this morning that that is a fact and not mere electoral hype. Okay, I'm going to stop so that we can have a conversation. So that's important. Oh, mug.
And we have great questions.
I forgot the mug. This is what, 135th episode. And I honestly got so wrapped up. Okay, wait a minute. I honestly, I got so wrapped up in what I was saying and I was like catching my breath. Okay, this is not going to be a surprise. How can I not use this mug? Thank you for engaging in democracy every Friday morning. Thank you for doing that. I've said it many a time. I'll say it at the end again. It's important that we do this. This is part of a larger whole. And the larger whole, we're going to get to play our part in that in just a matter of days. So I was digging in my cupboard looking for a democracy mug. It was like, yeah, okay, this is the one. So, okay.
And I believe that's a Carolee production, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe that is, I was about to say that, and I believe it is a Carolee production. Yep. It is a Carolee mug, yes.
Yep. And I'm having some connection issues, so I think I'm going to leave my camera off if that's okay for you, Joanne. I know it's weird to talk to an empty box, but
okay, well,
I'm borrowing someone else's internet, and I'm using my phone as a hotspot because the internet here is being used by 50 people on the other side of this wall. So,
okay.
Yep, we're having a very important discussion. We're trying to save democracy, Joanne, in the other room, in the form of our Board of Education is trying to derail our standards and set us back to the 1950s, and we're not letting that happen. So, but I
applaud that. I will surrender being able to see you while I talk to you for that.
And your friends at the AHA have been supporting us. And so for that, I thank them. I'm putting a shameless plug in for the AHA this morning. But we have great questions. And if I get cut off, I hope John will step in for me. But Dave has the first question. He says, historically, there have been states where the legislative bodies obtained a supermajority, enough to override a governor's veto, by getting half or less than 50% of the total votes cast statewide. He's asking, are there other successful examples? And he says it should be gerrymandering, but everybody says gerrymandering. But he's wondering, can you think historically of other ways where states have somehow gotten this supermajority, even though they had less than half the popular vote?
I can't speak to the specifics of that. The implication of that I can speak to, and it is gerrymandering, even though his name is Elbridge Gerry. Don't ask me how that happened, but it is true. Elbridge Gerry, gerrymandering. But at any rate, part of what's important, and I've said this before, that some of the glories of democracy are also the vulnerabilities of democracy. And the fact that we have a federal system of government where we have a national level and a state level, where there are levels of government, and that, you know, as I've said before, at the Constitutional Convention, one of the ways that the Constitution passed was because of federalism. People were terrified of nationalism, of the national government having so much power. And the idea of federalism, national government has some power, but local governments have some power too. That made this new government seem less intimidating. That deliberate sort of amorphous, well, some things are for one level of government and some things are the other, but we're not going to specify. That amorphousness can work well. That amorphousness can allow local governments, state governments to act on their own for better and worse, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, generally speaking, for state level governments to be able to act. I'm going to come back to the independent state legislature idea in a moment. But what that means related to the question is that there's manipulation, different things happen on a state level, again, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. I'm not saying in my comments here this morning that anything that happens that seems bad or that highlights one side over another, by definition, is bad. What I'm saying is that if you are actually playing the system so that you can't have that amorphous play of power shifting from one group to another, that's what I'm saying is bad. I also want to add in, this is not about supermajority, but it is about one problem of state government versus national government is this independent legislature idea. I signed on to a brief that was submitted to the Supreme Court, arguing with other wonderful historians that that's nonsense. The idea that state legislatures can simply intervene in elections in the direct way that people are claiming is based on some of what was said at the Constitutional Convention. That idea that state government, state legislatures can simply intervene in national elections based on supposedly something a Pinckney said at the Constitutional Convention, and that document, as they're citing it, doesn't even necessarily really exist. That's simply not the case. I don't know if it matters that historians are stepping forward and saying that no state legislatures can't just weigh in and control the way national elections go. But part of what I'm saying is that there are pros and cons to the fact that there's so many variables on a state level. You can get Wisconsin, that seemingly is just Republican, period. And that's where you have people saying, we're going to make it Republican forever. But that doesn't happen everywhere. Again, the vulnerabilities and the glories, the freedom that allows you to act that way, and the vulnerability that makes you vulnerable to manipulation of the system or to people who are extremists. These are the things, this has been hounding people all the way back to the founding. People at the beginning of our creation of our government were distrustful of democracy, at least many of them, partly because they understood that it could go anyway, that the people, the masses are unpredictable, and that's dangerous. They also disliked democracy on a certain level because they thought elite white people should be in power and democracy is problematic. But in addition to that, they understood the inherent, what do I want to call it? Flexibility, changes, contingency inherent in democracy. And that if someone could step forward and woo the people and get their trust and love, the whole system could tank. That goes all the way back. That continues to this day. That is part of democracy. It is part of why it isn't an absolutist, monarchical, unchanging form of government. Its glories are its vulnerabilities. And to preserve it, for that reason, we need to be aware of those vulnerabilities. We need to protect it, and we need to not take it for granted. That was a very long answer to that question, but okay, stepping off the soapbox.
It was really good. I took a lot of notes. Okay. This question comes from Bailey Paletti, and I don't think I remember Bailey being with us before. I'm not sure, Bailey, if you're first time, or maybe this is the first time you've put something in the Q&A, but I always love to meet new friends. So Bailey's question is, did the founders and early Republic generation have much to say about the democratic roller coaster of English Civil War? interregnum, I'm gonna mispronounce that word, of 100 years earlier, with pride's purge to the bare bones parliament, where the government itself emphasized and ignored election results in the name of solving the crisis of their ages. I don't know if that's a long question, and it's a pretty complicated question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can
You want me to say it over again?
answer that.
I know it's,
question.
I'm like more worried about mispronouncing the words. Okay, so Bailey's question was, did the founders and the early Republic generation have much to say about the democratic roller coaster of the English Civil War? From pride's purge to the bare bones parliament, where the government emphasized and ignored election results. I made it a little bit easier.
Well, so I'm not going to be able to specifically name examples of that, but what I will say, and it's always fascinated me about the way that the founding generation used history. This is a very Enlightenment way of thinking. They essentially, so the Enlightenment generally taught the idea that what you're supposed to do, really, that there are patterns in science, patterns in life, patterns in politics, that you should look for those patterns. And if you understand the patterns, you can better the condition of things, right? So you need to look for the patterns. In that spirit, many in the founding generation looked at all of history as a big grab bag in which they could pull different things from it and put them together and look for the patterns. And by discovering those patterns, they would know better what to do for the present. It's the spirit under which James Madison, in preparing for the Constitutional Convention, made what in essence is a kind of a list of republics, ancient and modern. And he just went through time looking at other republics of the past and what worked for them, what didn't work for them, and just a list, very Enlightenment-esque, so that he could go into the Federal Convention knowing like what works and what doesn't, and then we can address that and use that information in what we're doing and what we're shaping now. So there's no way that that generation would have ignored lessons coming from their own past as former British subjects. I just can't put my finger on, at least not right now while I'm sitting here, on a moment when they were doing that. But the spirit of how they addressed history generally would make that almost impossible not to happen.
All right.
And that was Bailey's second time speaking here. Bailey, I'm glad you spoke up.
Thank you, Bailey. Okay, so we have a question from Gloria, who's with us quite a bit. Thank you, Gloria. She asks, how would you characterize the act that when Donald Trump was elected, she says they were investigating false ties between him and Russia, and that he was almost being impeached before he even took office. And so she's wondering, like, upseating a fairly elected president, which is kind of ironic. I'm annotating that part, like where he's an election denier, and yet they're trying to upseat him through impeachment, is her point, right from the start. And even though that those ties between him and Russia, she says, were proven false. So she wanted to know if you could comment on that.
Well, I'm not going to comment on the investigation itself, and as to what it proved or didn't. We could have a separate debate about that. But what I will say is the fact that there were suspicions that were seemingly dangerous that needed to be investigated, and that the system investigated it in a legal way. So in other words, if people were investigating something that they suspected, something that there was actually seemingly proof for in a legal and authoritative way, and that they didn't use it to sort of act and take revenge, if it's the system in play, I'm not going to say that you can't use the system if it's in play. But I will say, and again, there's gray lines in politics, if you are simply attacking people and bringing them up for charges in a pure spirit of revenge, with no evidence really, just to get them. And there are some people now on the right who are saying that, like, just wait till we get into office. That's not the spirit in which this system should be deployed. Can we shape that? Can we change that? That's a separate question. But right, Dave is saying, I don't think that I don't think the Russian hoax is necessarily a hoax, but I'm not going to go into that here. But what I will say is, if you want to deploy the system to question something and decide if it's valid, and then abide by a legal political process that helps make that decision, okay. If you are simply out for blood and left and right just making charges and attacking, no, I don't believe in that. And I believe that there was reason to launch that investigation on Russia. I also don't think it was proven false, but again, I'm not going to go into it, but there was reason to investigate it. The investigation happened. The result of that wasn't people immediately turning around and saying, you know, throw the guy out. So the spirit of things matters too. I will now launch 1 million investigations to punish my enemies. That's really not a democratic action. I have serious suspicions about this, and I have evidence to suggest it, and I will launch a process that is legal and abiding by how these processes are supposed to work. That might be messy, but if there's a sincerity to it and a real suspicion, okay. My fear is that we might see coming up things, really a whole bunch of things that are going to be launched simply out of a spirit of revenge and attack. And obviously that's a problem.
Yeah. And I also do want to remind our friends in the chat to make sure that while we are expressing our opinions, and we do want people to express their opinions, we also want to remember that we're a community, and to keep all your comments respectful.
I've been missing that.
So we have, gosh.
Yeah, I normally try to say
we're good. I know we had an issue last week, and I want to make sure we always remember in mind that in the end, we're all here for the same reason. We want to engage in respectful civil discourse. Okay, so our good friend Dale always has good questions. Thank you, Dale. It says, is there a comparison between the Southern representatives in Congress using violence to force their policies on other representatives, and therefore the country, and the violence we're seeing today regarding voting?
Well, so there are different ways to answer that. I guess one similarity that I'll make. So part of the reason why Southern members of Congress, as I talk about in my last book, were using violence and threats of violence to silence opposition and protect the institution of slavery. One reason they were doing that was because they, on a certain level, knew that they were not necessarily an overpowering majority in numbers, and they were willing to do anything to protect the institution of slavery, whatever that is. If you fear that the demographics are against you, that's a great moment. Typically, that's when people say, oh, okay, let's opt to either illegal or violent ways of trying to keep power. So generally speaking, you know, the people who are trying to get you not to vote, they're trying to get you not to vote because they fear that if everyone votes, they will lose, right? So better to scare people off, scare the right people off. So part of the similarity is that kind of behavior is often a response to an awareness that you might not win, that perhaps you're even unlikely to win, and you seize on violence and threats as a way to get the right people to back away so that you will get what you want. Again, that's why those kinds of threats and that kind of behavior are inherently anti-democratic, right? We should all be able to vote without being afraid. We should be able to vote for whoever the heck we want without being afraid, and then tally up the results and have an election. And if people have a question about the election, then they can use the system to pursue those questions. And then once they're settled, they're settled. I saw someone say, it's interesting that I used the word revenge. Well, and the reason I use the word revenge is certainly people who have been talking that way in the recent past are suggesting that they're angry at people on the left who have been standing up to people on the right in some way, or holding them accountable in some way, or speaking out against them in some way, and that they're going to seek revenge against these people once they have power. I think that's the sense in which some people are using it.
All right.
And, right, and for losing, right? But I think it's also just, how dare you oppose us? Right? That's like the ultimate authoritarian claim. How dare you? That's like Star Wars. And what is the name of the Death? What's the name of the bad guy? Is that the Death Star?
Death Star. I'm not a Star Wars person, so I'm sure.
How
someone
dare you
is much more
oppose the Empire? You know,
right. The Empire. There you go.
Empire.
Yeah.
That's
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we have much better Star Wars people that can, like, I don't want to mess with them because that is a very big.
Yeah, no, and yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Greg asked, can you imagine a future where Europe takes the helm and becomes the world's bastion of democracy? In other words, like, United States is no longer considered the leader of the free world or whatever. He's asking that.
Can I imagine
that way?
Sure. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen here in a really fundamental way. Not like, oh, I wonder which party will be in power. We really don't know the fate of democracy here in the future. Big time contingency. This community is hearing about contingency for over 2 years now. You're primed for this moment. We really don't know. So can there be a future when the United States is no longer a leader in democracy and there's another nation that is? Yep, that could be a future. Will it be the future? I have no idea. But the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of possibilities right now, and some of them are pretty ugly. And you can't deny that they can happen. You can actually see ways in which they can happen. Doesn't mean they will, but is it possible? It's possible.
Okay.
Oh, you're still there. Okay.
I'm still here. No, I was pausing to make sure you were done. Okay, so here is one from our friend Cece. She says she's currently in a town where Governor Samuel Tilden is buried. Apparently, he ran for president in the 1870s, and it was considered very controversial. She found a historical marker that says candidate in 1876 disputed U.S. presidential election. So she's wondering if you could bring that story out.
I don't know the details of that story. I honestly don't.
We'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
All right, Cece, I'm going to challenge you back to find out because you're in the town. You can go to the local archives.
Well, and
I want you to tell us next Friday what you found.
I can try to remember to bring it for next Friday, but that's well past my detailed part of my database. So I don't know that. I did find something actually related to that, which I'll only mention here. So I was studying for my upcoming podcast, and I didn't know that seemingly the first election, for a variety of reasons, that ended up using polling was 1824. Because it was very close. There were a lot of candidates. Politics was really unpredictable. So that, which is why the Tilden thing made me think of that as a time when people were like, huh, is this system really working? How is it working? But I know that's not where we're going. I'll take that back. I was just highly intrigued to find that out. I found that out last night. So yes. Oh, that's right. Corbin,
give that
right. A novel about it.
All right, Cece, this teacher is giving you homework. Since you're in that town, I want you to find out more for next week. And if you find it earlier than next week, I want you to call me. All right. I love it when we get cool questions like that.
Lately, you guys have been like off the charts with your questions.
Right? I know. They're really up in the ante here. Okay, so Tim asked, what do you think of the Pinckney Plan, both as historical document and with its more recent use?
Well, that's one of the documents that is being claimed that it says that state legislatures can intervene in elections. And that's one of the, so this was very interesting. So in the brief that was sent to the Supreme Court, there's a whole section on the Pinckney plan because people are claiming that it has all sorts of implications about state legislatures and the electoral process. And there were email conversations between the historians when we were debating this. And what they were talking about was explicitly the Pinckney plan, but to the level of, well, there's a scrap of a piece of paper, but it doesn't really implicitly say this. And there's another piece that says that people were actually literally talking about the pieces of paper describing that Pinckney plan, which isn't a coherent plan that was seriously considered in any way. It's being made to be more central and more coherent than it ever was. So I can't go into the deep details on that, but I can say it was a fascinating conversation, right? To see historians knowing the implications of this and trying to really, with each other, try to understand what they felt to be true based on manuscripts. Was really interesting.
All right, this comes from Ellen C. Ellen asked, Joanne, can you speak to the removal of polling locations as a way of voter suppression? She said it happened at Texas A&M. Brazos County officials removed polling location on campus, which denied about 70,000 students an easier polling location. And including among those are 2,000 Corps of Cadet students pledged to serve their country in the military. So even in a place where many of the students learn from the more conservative side, the youth vote is being suppressed in this particular instance. But she wanted to know what you think about removal of polling locations in general as a form of voter suppression.
I think that's precisely what it is voter suppression. I think if you're moving polling places, if you're bringing down the number of polling places, if you're putting polling places, moving them to places that it's hard to get to by public transportation, if you're removing ballot boxes, if you're removing them sometimes to having one in a county or something, there are any number of ways in which you can claim that it's for security of the election, when there doesn't appear to be any reason, any way in which it helps the security of the election. All of these things are ways of discouraging people from voting. Different from a guy with a gun sitting outside watching a ballot box. But we've seen these things happening in recent years, one after another, just things being passed in any number of ways in different states, just making it harder, right? You can't vote as early as you could before, right? All kinds of things with mail-in ballots, clamping down on ways to vote. And in many cases, claiming it's about security, but then not proving in any way that has anything to do with security. It is making, anyway, I'm not even going to go into that, but yes, all of these things, including the one that was just mentioned, are ways of discouraging people from voting or just making it hard for people to vote, particularly people who work, people who don't have cars, there are all kinds of people who need to be able to get to polling places, and making it harder for those people is, in some ways cutting them out of the democratic process.
Yeah, and I think about when I taught in Richmond, a lot of my parents were on shift work. They worked in factories or at the airport. Those are two of the biggest employers, and they many times couldn't get to the polls during normal hours. So it was a big issue before we had more convenient early voting. All right.
Man,
this one comes from Sandra.
The chat's going wild here. Anyway,
yeah, the chat's a lot.
Sandra, we're going to have to go.
And people are already doing CC's homework for her.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Can we squeeze one more in?
Yep. Okay.
All right. Francesca says, I don't remember Americans not being pro-democracy despite either political party. And she's asking, has there been another time in our history where a large group of Americans were not pro-democracy?
Well, it depends on how you define not pro-democracy, right? I mean, it depends on how you define it. Think about McCarthyism. That's not inherently about the political process in the way that our current crisis is, but in a certain way, that's clamping down on people, again, based more on fears than anything else. I don't think there has been a party running on their actual resistance and refusal to abide by the democratic process. There are parties that have not wanted to abide by it, tried to rig it, manipulate it, but the current sort of cohesive, seemingly now institutionalized full rejection of our electoral process, we're blessed with that in a different way right now than we have been before. And now it's very quiet again. Is Annie still there? Oh, Annie is muted.
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry, I got cut off again. Yep, we're having some major internet issues here, but we still have 6 great questions. I know we don't have time for them. It's time for the after party, but I don't know if John has a way to.
Oh, you're muted again, Annie. Oh, man. Okay. Oh, now you're back. And muted
Sorry,
again.
I keep getting cut off. Can you hear me?
Yes. Now we can. Well, let me.
Sorry, I am here.
While you're figuring this out, I think this is a sign that we should go to the after party, and we can find out if we can make a list of the questions we didn't get to answer, and see what happens. But yeah, Carolyn,
that'd be great, John.
So I know it is a sign. So let us segue to the after party. So what's going to happen now, for those of you who are new, is we are going to head off into the after party. What that means is we are going to stop recording this conversation so we can be a little freer and easier in what we're saying and talk about whatever we like to talk about. So if you beamed in through the National Council for History Education website, just stay where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, you will need to leave Facebook and join us at ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too will be poof in the after party. Before we do that, I do want to say, as always, and particularly this Friday, thank you for being here to engage in the conversation of democracy on another Friday morning. 135 conversations we've had, and they matter. They matter because we can disagree and talk to each other. They matter because we're talking about the most basic things that you need to talk about in terms of democratic governance. And to talk about that always is important. To talk about that leading up to an election has an extra added bonus importance. So thank you for being here. Thank you for taking part in this. The simple fact that we are doing this and can do this and have done it for 135 weeks is a good, positive, hopeful thing. Support the spirit by voting on Tuesday. And we will see where we are when we meet next Friday, when I might have something to talk about that I don't know what it is right now. We'll see what happens with the election and to what degree they're determined to be settled after the voting stops. But at any rate, thank you guys for coming and for being here. And now let us segue to the after party.